Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Emily Martin. I am NCEDA's Program Manager, and we're excited to have you with us. Before getting started, we'd like to review the logistics of this webinar program. You'll see on the screen a few important logistics to read through as attendees. To reiterate, all attendees are muted and will stay muted during the presentation. The best viewing option for your screen is called Speaker View, which you'll see as a viewing option at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. During that segment and any time during the presentation, you can type in your question into the Q&A box. To access this option, click Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and then type in your question. These questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. If we are unable to answer all the questions live, NCEDA will send out a response sheet to all participants afterwards. Keep in mind, we'll be checking the Q&A box, not the chat box, so be sure to enter your questions there. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants to use as a resource. At this time, I'd like to introduce NCEDA Board President, Dr. Patricia Mitchell, who will offer welcoming remarks and introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Emily. Today's Lunch and Learn webinar addresses an ongoing topic for economic development organizations, even in normal times, that of strategic planning. Amid our current environment, it's especially important to revisit planning considerations in light of the new needs, new obstacles, new resources, new possibilities, and the new challenges that we are facing. I'm Pat Mitchell, President of NCEDA for about the next 5 days. I'm on the faculty at Appalachian State University, where I teach in the Graduate Public Administration program. And it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this latest installment in NCEDA's very active webinar series. In a moment, I'll introduce our moderator and the panelists. Today's discussion, entitled Course Corrections for Your Strategic Plan, is sponsored by Agricel Incorporated. We're very grateful for the company's generosity, which enables us to bring this valuable professional development content to our members. I also want to take a moment to thank NCEDA's annual sponsors. Emily is going to scroll their names and logos across your screens as I tell you about them. These are the companies and the organizations that stand with us and with our members year-round, offering financial support for NCEDA's important mission. We greatly appreciate the vital role they play in allowing us to bring programming and events. On March 11th of this year, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. The news set into motion a dramatic contraction in the global economy that has affected everyone. No one has been spared. In the days and weeks since then, economic development professionals have worked vigorously to be part of the solution, offering expertise and guidance to their companies and communities as they seek to limit the damage while complying with newly implemented public health directives. If you are like me and you like to make a plan, stay focused on it, these can be very frustrating times. We're reminded of what the Scottish poet Robert Burns once wrote: "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." And in these recent months, certainly much has gone awry. But planning remains key to what we do. At the very least, the COVID-19 crisis is leading all of us to revisit assumptions of our prior planning, and this can be daunting, but it also can be exciting. We have 4 experts today who will explore strategic planning issues in this highly unusual environment. Moderating today's panel is someone who needs little introduction to an NCEDA event. Crystal Morphus, founder and president of the Creative Economic Development Consulting, LLC. She has been a close friend, a partner, throughout her distinguished career as a practitioner and as a consultant. Leanne Howe is the owner and president of Applied Marketing Sciences, a strategic business development and target marketing consulting firm. Lee has more than 25 years of experience in industry intelligence, market research, and database management with economic development organizations and investment clients. Nathan Hewitt is Director of Existing Industry Services at the Catawba County Economic Development Corporation, a position he's held for the past 5 years. His career has included service as manufacturing market development leader at the North Carolina Industrial Extension Services, which is now known pardon me, as Industry Expansion Solutions. And finally, we have Jason Vaughn. Jason is Regional Business Director for the Southeast region at Agricel. His team covers the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia. Jason has 15 years of experience in a variety of roles in site selection, economic development, construction management, civil engineering, site design and certification, geotechnical engineering, construction materials testing, and consulting and environmental services. You can look at that introduction of those 4 individuals and see many years of experience that they're about to bring to us in what they will talk about in strategic planning. We're grateful to all these guests for sharing their insights. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, I'll turn today's webinar over to Crystal Morphus and thank all of you for being with us.
Good afternoon, NCEDA group. I'm glad to be with all of you and looking forward to this webinar today. Hopefully all the participants of this webinar have an economic development strategic plan and you're looking forward to some information on how to make course corrections to that plan today. If you don't have a plan already in place, now is an ideal time to develop one and to develop a roadmap. All of the uncertainty that we have faced over the last few months just really brings to the forefront the need for consensus around your economic development strategy, but also the flexibility, as Dr. Mitchell mentioned, to change course as needed. Even if you've had a strategic plan in the past, hopefully you have revisited that strategic plan on a regular basis to make course corrections, just as the market changes over time and your community changes. Strategic plans don't last as long as they used to because the pace of change is a whole lot faster. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, are changes. As we talk about some of those changes, keep in mind the difference between short-term, mid-term, and long-term changes. You can think of short-term changes that are impacted by the crisis phase of the pandemic that we're still in. And then there will be a recovery phase, those midterm strategies. And then once again, the economy will enter into an expansion phase. And that will, the expansion phase will be the longer term strategies. Many of your long-term strategies, or even a lot of midterm, will not change because the core assets in your community likely will not change. But there's going to be quite a bit of disruption to those short-term strategies. NCEDA put together a stellar panel today to talk about some of those changes. I'm really excited to have all of them here. I'm excited about Nathan Hewitt because I receive his newsletters from the existing business and industry program in Catawba County and always find them useful. And I learn things from Nathan and the information that he's putting out to his businesses. So I'm glad that he's here. I'm also glad that Jason Vaughn is part of our group today because Jason works in lots of communities in different places. So as we think about best practices from other regions and other states, Jason can talk about that as well, and I know he plans to today. And finally, Lee Howe is familiar to many of the people on this webinar. She has worked with many of you identifying your target sectors and in lead generation in particular. And she's been doing some work lately diving into some of those sectors that are really important to North Carolina, like automotive and aerospace, to see how they're changing. So I'm going to turn it over now to Nathan to get us started, and I'll join you again at the end with a few comments and then moderate some discussion.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Crystal. Go ahead and we'll start. We'll get moving real quick. Go through a lot of information. It's a business retention expansion is incredibly important right now. And as the slide says, it's business as unusual. I was talking to a local company here a couple weeks ago, and they used that term to describe how things are going right now. And I thought that was a perfect way to quickly encapsulate what's happening. Next slide, please. So the 4 truths of what's happening right now. You all know this. This is preaching to the choir in effect. BRE is really, it's never been more important. You know, keeping those existing companies in their communities, keeping them surviving, hopefully growing at one point in the future, that is paramount right now. Same time, the wide-ranging issues that are being asked of your BRE teams or your teams in general. You're getting asked everything from health and safety, you know, mask wearing requirements that just got put into executive order starting this Friday, to things like supply chain, finance, cash flow. All these things were literally coming at us still. We're coming at us rapidly, literally minute by minute from our local companies. So the wide-ranging issues has never been as extreme as it is right now. Same time, it's happened so quickly. I mean, we've had terrible economic events and other events in this country's history, but something so widespread and so rapid just seems abnormal historically for us. And obviously, distance. You know, I'm talking to you right now from Hickory in my office, but we're all across North Carolina on a Zoom meeting. Distance makes relationships, which a lot of our business and a lot of business retention and expansion is built off of. So it's never been more challenging to actually do a job that's most important now. Next slide, please. All right, let's see how many participants drop off now. I'm glad we've got the best of the best on here, because a slide like this will scare a lot of folks off. Here's how I've been thinking about this whole pandemic. If you're a little bit familiar with Abraham Maslow, he was a psychologist in the 40s who came up with this hierarchy of needs. It was kind of a pyramid approach of thinking through, I have to have life's basic necessities before I can get to things like higher order levels of thinking, creativity, self-expression. And you can apply this to the business market, but to understand kind of that hierarchy of needs, think of a starving artist. In Maslow's world, that doesn't exist, because if you're starving, if you don't have the basic life necessities of shelter and food, you can't get to creativity. So applying this to business, you can do the same thing. So right now, on the bottom of the pyramid is always that health and life safety and actually keeping in compliance with regulations. And as you go up, you eventually get to, yeah, we're growing, revenue growth, and things like branding and differentiation from your competitors. So you can't get to those top level things that really make a business sustainable and growth unless you have the basic building blocks. At the same time, we really, in our world, we always like timelines and chronological order. I was part of a webinar not too long ago with Eric Canada from Blame Canada, who does a lot of work with existing industries across a lot of EDOs and their BRE programs. And he looked at this period as it's going to be broken out into 4 phases. Survival, survivor, rebuilding, growing. And this is looking at really like a 3 to 4 year timeline. I'll kind of detail these out. Next slide, please. So with each of those stages, we're talking a time period, but we're also talking different needs for each of those stages based on that kind of where they're at in the pyramid. So right now we're in survival. I know you talk to your local companies or you hear it, they're still facing an onslaught of issues. Some of them will definitely not survive this period. We hope that many do if we're proactive and thinking strategically about how we can best assist. That's our job. So you can see some of the factors that come into play. Right now, like I said before, life and safety, that's paramount. Keeping in compliance with HR regulations, supply chain, either downstream or upstream, that all is of paramount importance right now. Eventually, we're going to move to that survivor stage, where the best way to describe survivor stage in my mind is almost that shell shock experience. They're still weak in state. They're not out of the woods yet, but they can eventually get back to rebuilding and growing if we take care of a couple of things like they're going to be looking for efficiencies, basically cost-cutting measures. So is your BRE program in a place where you can help them deal with things like lean manufacturing, deal with financing needs that are going to come up that will help them at least sustain the business for a period till they're back to where they need more fixed capital. So these things, I won't detail them all just for time's sake, but these are the facets your BRE program and your EDO really need to be aware of as we get further along this recovery curve. Next, please. So I have been doing this since 2007. I left for a little while, as Dr. Mitchell had referenced, but I came back here and been here the last 5 years. I feel like I've built a fairly good program. We have a great team in place here, but gosh, this thing, we learned so many lessons from it early on. And two that really seemed to stick out the most, information. Information was paramount, time of it, relevancy was important for companies that needed to know about the PPP program or the last executive order. The range of information that was necessary was incredibly important, but at the same time, they were getting inundated with it. And this relates to the next point. We're in a business to be heroes, honestly. We're economic heroes. There are people in our communities that are our allies and our partners that they're in the same business. They're there to be heroes and to be helpful. The bottom line, that's what we're trying to do, is to be helpful to our communities. And so we had a lot of well-intentioned folks just like ourselves. We all had COVID-19 resource pages. We all had webinars going on. We all had all these various voices that, if collectively combined, probably would have been a better effort. Next slide, please. So some of the things that I've personally taken out of this, that we've enacted some of it already. Open partnerships. So partnerships throughout this period with our Small Business Technology Development Center, our local chamber, the Small Business Network through the community college. Those folks have been awesome. We have relied upon them greatly. Their expertise, their resources and tools they can bring to bear that we just don't admittedly have in-house. One thing that we had actually enacted before this over the last year is something I call the Catawba Information Agency, CIA for short. And we actually meet with our partners at the local workforce board, the chamber, some of our education partners. We have a very open, honest discussion of what's going on in our world. So we share information openly. You know, did someone leave this company? We heard this potential layoff coming. It runs the full gamut. And that actually came to our advantage when the pandemic happened, because we had that kind of free, open exchange of information. We went online with it through Slack. And so that actually helped us having those open partnerships, but yet we still need more of those in our community. Another part that has made this difficult, made this a difficult period, is just that means of connection. We have so many things going on. Some of us are at home, some of us are at the office. We're really kind of far flung at this point. And having a means of connection with your companies has gotten increasingly difficult. And so one thing, you need to look almost for new tools and new ways to make that connection, to be flexible with things that they may have going on at their companies that you can better assist. So things like meeting schedulers. One thing I have done is I used to just call up and say, you know, here's when's available for you. You potentially never hear back because it creates about 5 emails for every 1 email or call that you've made. So I just now started using a calendar scheduler, and I literally send it to them and send the link and say, okay, you pick the time. Here's my calendar, my open dates. You go with what works best for you because you already know it works best for me. Cut down all 5 of those emails just down to 2. Same thing with Slack, a great tool, or Microsoft Teams, or some of these things out there that people are becoming more familiar with. I've started using those with some local companies. We started using those with local partners, just as a means of information exchange without 100 emails. Kind of running out of time a little bit, always open for questions later, but we'll go to the next slide, please. So there's always some values that are going to be there before or after this pandemic. Relationships will remain essential for whatever you do in the EDO world, or definitely for BRE. Same time, you have to bring value. So we never waste a company's time. I've learned that really early on, and I've always held to that. And what that builds you is credibility for moments like this, for moments when people really need to trust that you're going to assist, that you're going to be there to help them. You need that relationship intact for potential years and decades. And of course, you got to know everything, or at least give the impression you know everything or can learn everything. And when those very rare instances when you don't, you got to know the right people that can best assist. Like I said, we've really relied upon some great partners throughout this whole period because they have the expertise we don't have. So you got to know your limitations as well. But these are values that are going to be there post-pandemic, well beyond any of us. So last slide, please. And with that, I'm very happy to introduce Jason Vaughn with Agricel down in Greenville, South Carolina.
Hey, thanks, Nathan. Hey, I'm gonna get started. I did a quick run through this morning and I had about 41 minutes. So I'm gonna try to be fast. I'll talk fast and certainly have some questions at the end. So next slide, please. We've got 4 areas we want to talk about here when it comes to product development. We want to talk about the competition. That's usually the first thing as a developer. We want to know what's out there. Also, the idea of just keeping the pedal to the metal, keep doing what you're doing, and we'll get into that in more detail. A couple ways of how communities have been creative in engaging with product development, and also how to engage private developers. So next slide. So this is a little levity to the presentation here. This is you know, what I think about when you think about competition, especially across state lines. Certainly North Carolina embraces the regionalism approach, I think, a little more than some other states. Virginia does a good job as well. Next slide. So just want to talk about Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. So in Virginia, there's not a lot of available buildings from a spec or product development standpoint. A lot of their numbers are skewed from Amazon. They've got a lot of activity in Northern Virginia. But the State Department, Virginia Economic Development Partnerships, just promoted Penny Brazeau. She's a 20-year veteran of VEDP to the products team, and they're moving in that direction. So Virginia's revamping their certified site programs, and they're going to be putting more state dollars into getting product ready. Georgia, as you can imagine, it's Atlanta. Most of their development is probably 5 to 10 miles off the interstate. Lots of large boxes. Amazon also plays a part in their market, owning about 9 million square feet. So in Georgia, there's probably around 20 plus million square foot of spec space either ready, under construction, or planned for 2020. And most of that is e-commerce growth. And they also have a new inland port in the northwest part of the state. So that's having an impact on it as well. Only a handful of rural communities in Georgia have spec buildings, and most of those are smaller, geared towards manufacturing folks. South Carolina, you know, here we have 75 spec buildings, and we keep that list pretty accurate. Of those 75, 35 are community owned. That represents about 15 million square feet across the state. And if you do that math, the average size is 200,000, which they're being skewed by large boxes near Charleston and the inland port here in Greer, Spartanburg area. Most of those 35 community-owned spec buildings were financed through the Santee Cooper Loan Program, which Crystal Morph is very familiar with, and she helped get started maybe 7 or 8 years ago. It is a loan program. They do pay back. There's a 3-year deference there, and then they pay back at a low interest rate over the next, I think, 6 or 8 years. But not sure if that program is going to be here in the future. Santee Cooper is going to be sold here in the next maybe year or so. So not sure how that's going to work. North Carolina, there's not a lot of data from the state that's tracked. I think they sent a request out for that data, and certainly private specs are much harder to track. Community-owned specs are probably a little easier. But Austin Rouse, he's on the call. We talked a couple weeks ago, and just in a quick conversation, we had 22 counties that had spec buildings in North Carolina out of the 100. So it's not a bad representation there. So that's kind of the competition that's out there for North Carolina and how North Carolina stacks up with some of the other states. Next slide. So the next thing is, with the races going on, if you ain't first, you're last. That's a quote by Ricky Bobby there. Next slide. So the intent here is just to keep your foot on the gas. There's lots of activity coming back around. We've seen a sharp increase in activity the past 3 weeks. And we like to say it's like a golf ball in a hose pipe. I'm from the South, so hose pipe is also a faucet. But that activity has been building up, and we're seeing a lot of new activity here, and balancing the priorities between, what Nathan talked about, existing industry is very important. Richard Blackwell, he passed along this saying that it's a lot easier to maintain what you've obtained. So stay on that path, stay on your strategic plan, and just be ready to pivot at some point in the future. And I think a lot of communities have already done that. Next slide. So there's my creativity. I couldn't come up with a good picture here. So next slide. So I want to talk about kind of 5 examples of creative activities or adaptations we've seen in the Southeast here. Again, we cover 4 or 5 states. Talked to 200 local economic developers, and we've got some good ideas here. So the first one's virtual site visits. There's a previous NCEDA webinar by Dan and Keith and Aaron and Beth about virtual site visits and how to do those. There's a recording for that. You can certainly go back and watch if you missed the presentation. But one of the things we wanted to say is if you do a virtual site visit, you want to make sure you do it right. Be thorough, hire a professional, make it personal, and showcase your community in some aspect. Quality of life, especially Western North Carolina does a great job at that. Quality of life, North Carolina East does a good job of that as well. So the short-term goal in this stage of the site selection process is to get them in your community. That's what we always say we always hear is, if we could just get them to visit, I think we could close the deal. Let's see, big box closings. So you look at Amazon's recent bid on JCPenney locations. 2019, there were 10 billion square foot of retail across the country. And of those, 9,300 closed in 19, and would suspect there's going to be more opportunity for repurposing adaptations for some of these facilities. Pennsylvania had a good example. Josh applied for and received a grant to add some additional warehouse space to an existing building to market to potential prospects for warehousing needs. So basically he put a spec building on the side of a building with a grant. That is the first we've seen that. Existing industry spaces, comb your existing industries. And if you have some industries that are contracting and some are expanding, try to find that balance between the two and see if the contracting industries would be open to leasing space to your expanding industries. In BRE, like Nathan said, it's relationships, and knowing their business and how they're doing could lead to some synergies there. And then site preparedness, I'd say 98, 95, somewhere around there % of prospects that come to AgriSell, they're looking for a building or a pad ready site. That hasn't changed in a while. And we've been on some site visits, just some funny examples. We've had cows in the field. Just a quick note, Chinese do not like to see cows on their industrial site. We've seen sites covered up with corn stalks, 8 foot tall, and we actually rode through those corn stalks and couldn't see too much. We've seen boats, completely wooded sites, cars in the lot. Just one thing to understand is once you get a prospect there in your community, that's a huge first step. But realize being prepared or unprepared is going to be received very quickly, either through your virtual site visit or your RFP response. And then again, I got a civil engineering background, so I'll say know your sites better than anyone. Know the utilities, the location, the capacities. If we're going to build a building and an ESFR is required, already know if that water line is going to have sufficient pressure to supply the building. Have your topo maps, your surveys, know the price, and have a sense of due diligence items. If you can't have those due diligence done, maybe you have some desktop due diligence done, but certainly have a conceptual site plan that shows what could be built on the site and what's the developable acreage. All right, next slide. All right, so I'll come back to this beginning with the end in mind, and next slide. All right, so this is what I wanted to get to. Kind of some tidbits to take away from this. So know your product, know the dirt, know the community attributes, and know your competition within 30 miles, and know the manufacturing base in your region, not just your community, who's across the line, and how do you stack up with them, and what's your best opportunity to win if you're thinking about product development. Also know what your leadership's going to support. Will they support abated taxes? Will they backstop a deal, which we'll talk about in a minute? Or will they lease it if it's not leased to somebody else? And know your likely targets in that regard. So beginning with the end in mind, so we think about what's the definition of success. And we think of the example, if you're not getting prospect visits, or if you're not getting through the triage stage in the RFPs because you don't have a car in the lot, as people say, jump back to the question, what's your competition? So does an adjacent neighborhood have a 105,000 square foot building right on the interstate. So does it make sense for you to build a 90,000 square foot, 45 minutes off the interstate? So those are some things to think about. And if you could increase your likelihood to make it through do you have a building pad or a pad ready site question, if that leads to actually getting prospects in your community to do a visit, is that a win? So does that count towards a successful visit? And I say that because some communities look at spec buildings or pad sites as marketing pieces. So there's been a few times where we've drawn through an industrial park to go look at a pad site, and the clients say, hey, I like this, it's bigger, I think my building would fit nice here, is it available? And the short answer is always yes. So this has happened to us twice here in South Carolina. In the Oconee Industrial Technology Park, there's a pad ready site, 50,000 square foot, all utilities at the very back of the site. So we brought 2 people in to the back. They didn't like that site. Their building didn't fit, but they ended up purchasing Agricel ended up purchasing 2 other sites in the industrial park. So all told, $50 million of investment, 200 jobs within the park, but the pad is still sitting there. It's not sold. It's not developed. No one's purchased it. The community spent a lot of money to get it ready. So was that pad worth it? In our opinion, absolutely yes. And I'll go over, the assumptions. A lot of prospects come with us. They're going to assume you're going to give them free land. You're going to abate taxes. Those assumptions are getting higher the past 2 years. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but they do expect a lot when they get here. So here are 4 examples of how you can engage with a developer in your community. The first one is deferred fee development. So let's say your developer or Agricel would act as the construction manager. The community would own the building, own the land. They would finance it, and Agricel or your developer would manage it for free until the building is sold. And then if the building's sold, you just pay the developer a set determined fee. And if the building does not sell, then you don't owe a fee. Agricel or the developer just put in their sweat equity in the project. The second one is the EDO carries the cost through a lease. We've done this several times in Mississippi. So we'll build a spec building. The community will lease it back from the developer at a reduced rent rate, just to cover the carry cost. And that's much better than having to pay back, which is this next example of a backstop, where you can just pay back a monthly payment of $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, whatever kind of building you build. Or the backstop example is the community buys it back after a set period of time, 2, 3, 4 years. And that's a $4 or $5 million payment. And that's much harder to do. And it's not a good situation for developers or the community. Certainly not something you want to run into. And then the last is just a master plan developer. Either the community owns the land, developer owns the land, and the developer builds a spec building. If it sells or leases, they rinse and repeat and do it again. We've seen that work really good with some other developers in North Carolina. So that's all I got. I'm sorry, I was talked super fast. Thanks for your time. Call us with questions, and we want to be a resource for you to help you bring deals to the finish line in your communities. So I'm going to pass it over to Lee with Applied Marketing.
Hi, this is Lee. I'm excited to talk to you today. I am going to talk a little bit about, shifting your target industries, and talk about, what's happening really to circle back to what Crystal said to begin with, in the short term, midterm, long-term strategies. Overall, we've been having some questions from clients like, that I expect you have. What do we do in the short term? What will be affected? What's, if you will, delayed overall? And, supply chains, of course, will be a top priority in what we're doing. And as we talk through each of these little industry sectors and targeting as a whole, supply chains have been disrupted all over, whether it's manufacturing or logistics, consumer products, that sort of thing. How will that affect each one of your target industries? Specifically, I've been tracking automotive and aerospace industries just because they are a cornerstone of all of your targets, mostly in the Carolinas, but, all over in different pockets of the US. But, automotive was already on a downturn, which, is really, no surprise. We started off the year expecting it to, hit that downturn. And, of course, aerospace and the travel industry that, its supplies it's been, dropped off the edge. So, but it is really just delayed. And, I've gotten questions from clients as, should we target something else? Should that even be on our target list? And, my answer to them typically has been yes. I mean, it is still a cornerstone target, but you may, elect not to put a lot of resources in there, at least in the short term. But there will be opportunities. There's opportunities in those supply chains. They've found, weaknesses in their supply chains. There may be manufacturers that want to hold more inventory. So that's, that's a warehousing opportunity. There certainly is a lot of talk on reshoring. We'll get to see how that all plays out. That's, kind of unknown as to who will pull the trigger on some of that, but certainly, that's been a hot topic. But, overall, we continue to make lead generation calls here in our office. We do get companies talking to us, that they're still considering things, they're gathering information, willing to talk to our clients and all. And you may want to look down chain from automotive and aerospace, because they may be supplying, industries in addition to that. So they may be out of that survivor mode and into planning, which, a lot of the industries, of course, are still in that surviving mode. Life sciences and medical industry, of course, there's, going to be some opportunities there. With the pandemic and serving the medicines and the medical supplies. But there's also going to be a lot of pent-up demand from healthcare that has been delayed during the pandemic. So while some of that industry has, paused with the rest of us, certainly I think you'll see some pent-up demand there. And again, supply chain is such a key. You're going to hear me say supply chain, probably 100 more times, but certainly is what's driving that. Let's go ahead to the next slide. I have some other manufacturing sectors that you may want to think about prioritizing on your targets if they fit in your area. And I should probably even just name this industry sectors to prioritize, because logistics will play a piece in all of this. And I know a lot of us talk, from time to time about, do we want to put resources into targeting logistics? Well, certainly if you have the product, and now definitely is the time to put some marketing dollars behind that. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunities may come, certainly. But consumer products, anything tied to e-commerce, your paper products, your health products, and packaging is kind of tied into the consumer products, and the new focus on being sanitary, not transferring viruses and germs and that sort of thing. But a lot of this is coming from the pandemic and from the last few months, that it's accelerating some focus on automation equipment and material handling equipment, as companies want to rely on that equipment to keep them going when maybe less workers would not necessarily a great thing, but that's where we were headed anyways. I think it's just accelerating some of that that trend. Food and beverage, always a staple industry. I think it is getting extra, priority because, we're focused on safety, and, food and beverage is a big part of that. But the industry in general is changing, tied to restaurants and cooking at home and prepared meals, that sort of thing, meal kits. So certainly I think there's going to be opportunity there. Plastics and metals, of course, those are big inputs to both, aerospace and automotive, but also many, many other industries. So those, depending on the company and the industries that they're serving, there certainly may be plenty of opportunities in those areas. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a minute about office needs as well, and targeting, your business and professional services, because there's really some competing trends as to some of the impact that the pandemic's had. Again, it's just accelerating certain technologies, but having some influence on the thought of, where do you want your offices, that sort of thing. So, of course, remote work, everyone's had to figure that out and the technology to go with it. But the companies that provide that technology and the access are certainly going to, find opportunities to grow. There's been discussion of, moving, out of the high population areas. So there's going to be opportunities maybe in suburban or rural areas for, some service positions, some business and professional services. Revised office layouts. So is our companies going to rethink their open office, neighborhood office policies, that sort of thing. So, and are we going to, see, a circling back to, more enclosed offices, that sort of thing. But telehealth and healthcare needs, again, the pandemic really just accelerated a trend there for telehealth, to do telehealth visits. Personally done that and over the last couple months, and it was awesome. I mean, that's a great way if you just need to talk with your doctor. So, and then education trends. I mean, the teachers and all the students, and how is distance learning going to really be affected by, the technology there, and, how they had to adapt to the situation. So I think, a lot of these areas got a big leap forward. So next slide, and I'll try to, summarize here for a minute. I think, again, you want to look short-term and mid-term, and that's really what I'm talking about as far as shifting your targets. And you might think about putting your resources into some of those other areas other than automotive and aerospace, as far as attraction and lead generation. But feel free to reach out if you want to discuss what's going on in your area. We try to keep a pulse on, talking to companies. We're reaching out to companies every day on behalf of our clients, but I'm always interested in what's happening in your local markets and how that affects industry. But feel free to reach out, and I will throw it to Crystal, one of my favorite people now, and she can wrap us up here.
Thank you, Lee. So you've been listening to some great ideas on how to shift 3 core components of your strategic plan, a BRE, product development, and your target sector of business recruitment strategy. Another key component we're not covering today is marketing, but NCEDA has a seminar, a webinar devoted to that topic, so they'll make sure they get to that. So I'm going to talk about how you can internally course correct your strategic plan with this information, or of course you could use someone to help you either internally or get some support to update your strategic plan. Next slide. So understanding the new landscape, and that's what some of you are doing today on this webinar, understanding some of the shifting landscape. There's a lot of new economic data you can access. You've probably tapped into the unemployment claims data, which we're able to get now by county, which we weren't able to get before. You're probably watching not only unemployment claims, but if you are subscribed to JobsEQ or a similar service, you're looking at real-time job postings and other information that helps you understand what's happening to your local economy. Many of you have done surveys of your existing business. Just a reminder, our firm is still offering free business retention expansion surveys, COVID-19 survey impact surveys through August 30th. So if you have taken advantage of it, we don't mind doing a second one for you so you can see what's changed. If you haven't taken advantage, give us a call and we'll be glad to help you with that. And survey your investors. Many of you are funded by both the public and private sectors, and so you'll want to know their plans for continued investment in your organization. Make sure you're checking in with your anchor institutions, not just local government partners or chambers of commerce, but think of those other key anchor institutions. They could be utilities, transportation related, key destinations in your community like museums, cultural centers, for example, of course, educational institutions, and see what their recovery strategy is and how they're doing and how that will impact your update to your strategic plan. I hope that you have some type of local COVID task force, recovery task force. I've heard some communities had one and then they stopped meeting when they thought the crisis was over, but that task force should continue to meet through the recovery phase, really focus on economic development as the health crisis hopefully will wind down at some point. We focus more on the economic crisis. Next slide. Of course, you want to engage your leadership in the update of the strategic plan. I always suggest you engage your leadership at a high level. Your vision for your economic development strategy probably won't change, but the mission and how you carry out that vision may. So for example, if your organization has not focused on small business development, for example, that may be something, if there's a gap in your community that you're working on now, or entrepreneurship. Anytime there is disruption or a big reset, as we're seeing now, that's going to create a lot of opportunities for business startups. Just as businesses are failing, other people will see market opportunities there. Your board or leadership also can provide input into the updated SWOT analysis and of course your goals. And the ways to engage them, a good way right now are surveys, one-on-one engagement with board members, with county commissioners, city council, and of course some facilitated small group sessions would be good too. Next slide. But the real meat of updating the strategic plan is of course going to come from staff who's working your strategic plan, and they'll work at the strategy and action step level. So leadership works at a high level, staff works at the ground level. So reviewing each area of that program of work. So just like Nathan was talking about the BRE program and how they're carrying out the retention strategies now, revisit that piece of your program of work, revisit product development, and ask yourself, what do we need to change in the short term, midterm, long term? Again, short term will probably be changed quite a bit if for no other reason how you're carrying out those action steps in your strategic plan. And then mid-range in the next couple of years will still be probably in the recovery phase. Most economists still believe we will not enter the expansion phase until still maybe 2022, because we've got so much ground to make up that we lost from 2019. So think about those short-term, mid-term, and then revisit the long-term strategies. There's probably not going to be a lot of changes to your long-term strategies if your plan is like it's supposed to be based on your strategic assets, but just revisit those. And those recovery strategies in the short term will be really important. Think about the strategies for existing business, how you're changing your marketing strategy, your recruitment strategy. For example, things like incentive compliance, we talk about quite a bit now, but all aspects of the program and those short-term strategies. Next slide. And then review your metrics. I had a wonderful conversation last week with an EDO in one of the metros in South Carolina. And we talked about how his program metrics have got to change. His project managers are judged based on the number of projects they work and the number of locations and jobs and investment. And that's going to be a lot different this year. And unfortunately, most economic development groups still are judged by those traditional factors. And this year is going to be quite a bit different. So revisit those program metrics with your leadership and talk about how they're going to change your organizational metrics as well. That could include maybe changes in fundraising for your organization. And then if you're not tracking community well-being, this is just a plug to start thinking about that and doing that. The place I think does the best is the city of Greer. Does a great job at tracking overall community well-being. And that's going to be even more important as we go through a very high unemployment time in our communities. There are going to be more people with greater needs. And so tracking overall community, when I say health, I mean economic health. Of course, there are other aspects of health to track as well. And then think about a COVID recovery dashboard. And I don't mean particularly the health statistics. Those are important to look at in your community. But think about those economic data points that you should be tracking, like the real-time job postings. You have an airport, TSA screenings, especially if you're in a tourism community, hotel occupancy, retail sales, anything that can tell you how your economy is recovering from the pandemic will be important. So next slide, kind of just to wrap up at the end. So as we think about your strategic plan, or as you think about your strategic plan going forward, revisit it. Now's a great time. Look at those short-term strategies, what needs to be modified, midterm and long-term. Engage your board at a high level and engage your anchor institutions and your partners, but then really get the staff sharpening the pencil and the paper to work on that strategic plan to make sure that it reflects the work that you need to be doing today. So with that, if you'll put any questions in the Q&A, I've got some for our panelists, and I'm going to go to some that we have in the Q&A already. Nathan, make sure Nathan and Jason and Lee, if you'll unmute yourselves. Nathan, the first question is for you. What calendaring tool are you using for meeting scheduling right now? And I see you chuckling about that. Is that good? A good question?
Yeah, I saw that in the question and answer part. I use a tool. I'm a big kind of like systems and tools kind of guy to make my job as efficient and easy as possible with things like that. I use Calendly, so calendar, but it's the AR and LY is at the end. It's free. There are multiple ones out there. I see some other people responding that there may be integrations within their existing email provider. So that's just one tool I use, but there are a number of others out there.
Thank you. And Sarah from EDP&C has offered that EDP&C has a new marketing piece targeted at attracting more suppliers to the state, and you can ask her for a copy. That's Sarah Bernhardt with the EDP&C. Thank you for that comment. Bookings is another tool. I guess anyone could comment or maybe return in the chat if you're using Bookings. I use Calendly as well for scheduling meetings. So a couple of other questions. Jason, I have a question for you. So we expect manufacturing inventories to rise. Manufacturers, many of them were caught with the pants down with this just-in-time delivery, and so now they're going to increase inventories. And that's going to require more distribution space. What are you seeing as some ideal specs, particularly for ceiling height, for companies looking for distribution space? Because some people may wonder if a building in their community will fit for that sector.
Yeah, typically, certainly a good engineering response to that is it depends. Typically, we're seeing 32 is going to be the minimum for those types of warehouses. We're seeing them go up to 40. Once you clear 40 feet, your sprinkler system changes, especially depending on what you're storing. That could be pretty expensive. But we've got a project now, we're looking at 60 to 85 foot clear. It's a manufacturing facility, not your typical building, but 32 would be the absolute minimum, I think, that we would want to work with.
Thank you. Lee, what recruitment strategies are you recommending to your clients to replace trade shows and mission trips? And again, I was talking to somebody last week and I was like, darn, that was like one of the funnest parts of our job, was to go to trade shows and mission trips and network with people and meet new people. And so that fun part of our business has been taken out. So what are you suggesting people do now?
We are carrying on with lead generation, setting up phone calls or Zoom meetings, in place of that, certainly. And that's what we're recommending, at least for the rest of this year. We'll see, if some of those trade shows are going to happen in the fall. We're not sure yet, but you may not want to travel to them anyways. But so, whether it's phone calls or some virtual meetings, we're even suggesting that for maybe site selectors as well, because many of economic developers will go visit them and go to the conferences, and they may certainly be willing to do some Zoom meetings, especially regionally, just to hear about what's going on, because they continue to work with their clients who have needs. So basically phone calls.
Nathan, here's one more question for you. If you can make one financial investment in your BRE program, and I'll say that money's no limit, we know it is, but let's just
okay.
If you could make one financial investment that you think would make a real important impact right now, what would that be?
Wow, no, money is no object?
Just for the fun of today's discussion.
Just for the fun of it? Oh, that's because that's our realities. Okay, good. It will relate back to financial, but I honestly think the more resources you can devote from a staff standpoint, I know in our office, so I'm one of 5 here in Catawba County. I'm almost exclusively related to the BRE side. So I tend to, that's my umbrella. But I think warranting the times right now, you could, with unlimited budgets, in this world of crystal, that you should potentially devote more BRE, hire additional staff related to BRE, potentially a specialist in some area that maybe a partner agency does not either have the resources or you can't go to them as easily. So I could see adding basically extra horsepower to, so you could split up, in essence, the community partners that you need, the local companies that you needed to probably have deeper working relationships with. I know one thing we did really early on is, especially literally the days of us all kind of pulling out of the office, I put all of my big, huge company contact list on Google Drive, and our whole team, so literally every single person here, we divvied it up. Even though it was not their main responsibility, that was, at that moment, that seemed like a very good thing to do, is at least reach out one-on-one, make that kind of show of, we care about you, and keep up with this the next many weeks and months, because we're going to be coming out with relevant information. And so in that particular case, we put a lot of time, financial resources of everyone's, their responsibilities to the side, and we focus just on working with our local companies. So I almost think you need to keep that going in some capacity for, at least for the foreseeable future in my mind.
So as we're wrapping up, I'll just follow up just quickly with that we are recommending that economic development groups take the unspent travel money and investing it in staff development and technologies that are helping you work more efficiently and effectively during this crisis phase. So for example, helping staff get really good at virtual visits, or redirecting staff energy to business retention and expansion. But that money that was sitting there, that was traveling to that trade show, use it now in a different way. So for the participants, I hope that you have gathered or learned some information that will help you in course correcting your strategic plan. Feel free to reach out to Nathan, Jason, or Lee, or myself with any follow-up questions. We're eager to help you and see you succeed. So I'll turn it back over now to, I guess, Dr. Mitchell. Pat, I think you need to unmute yourself.
I do. So that was a practice where I was talking there. Crystal, Lee, Nathan, and Jason, thanks for that excellent discussion. I personally heard some great ideas in it, but there's also something else I heard, and that is in the positivity in your words, in your attitudes, and in your planning, in how you're planning for the challenges that you are facing, and that's a great thing to hear. This concludes today's webinar. I want to thank again our sponsor today, Agricel, as well as the long list of annual sponsors that we showed you earlier. Their support is certainly valuable as we continue to offer worthwhile programming to our members. Our Professional Development Committee, under the leadership of Josh Hollingsy, and our excellent staff, Liz Lawrence and Emily, as they continue to organize new webinar offerings on timely topics. Please watch your email, because there will be additional information about upcoming offerings. We continue to hope that we can see you in person soon, perhaps at our annual conference, which is currently scheduled for August 25th through the 27th in Wrightsville Beach. And finally, as you embrace all the possibilities that lie ahead for your organization, your community, and in serving the state of North Carolina, please stay connected with NCEDA. Stay confident, stay well, and thank you for being with us. Good day.